Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our LAFCO meeting of March 14th. And first on the agenda, if Candace, you'd please call the roll.
1 second. Oh my God. Let's see. Judy Arnold is absent. Alternate Kate Sears.
Here.
Jeff Blanchfield is absent. Alternate Christopher Burdick. Carla Condon.
Here.
Damon Conley.
Here.
Craig K. Murray.
Here.
Gary Phillips. Jack Baker.
Here.
Alternate seated in the audience, Lou Caius.
Here.
Roll has been taken.
Thank you. I welcome you all, and especially we have new members, new faces here. We have Jack Baker, and as alternate, we have sitting in our audience, Lou Caius. Welcome. Now we'll see sometimes you up here instead of out there, right?
Right. Looking forward to working with all of you.
Okay, thank you, and we as well. Now it's time for open time, and that is if anyone has any comments that they would like to make on topics that aren't on the agenda, you're welcome to do so at this time. If it warrants any type of response, you will receive response in writing. And if the commission decides that it is an item that should be agendized for later discussion, we'll do so. So is there anybody here that would like to speak at open time? Seeing none, we will then close that section of our meeting, and we have no consent items, so we will move quickly right along to our public hearing item. And this is a continuation of the countywide water municipal service review, the draft profiles on East Marin agencies. And this has been continued from the April 9th meeting, and we will do one more review. It is, will encompass the limited portion of West Marin in the Point Reyes Station area, as well as the East Marin agencies. The profiles here are being presented for your initial feedback, and we look forward to initiating a formal public review with a final report codifying these profiles and the analyses up in August of this year. And so at this point, we will receive a verbal report from our director, and then we will open the hearing for any further comments.
Well, thank you, Chair Condon. So as you mentioned, this public hearing has been continued from the April meeting where staff did a very brief introduction of the item before you to give everyone, and staff included, a little more time to digest what are relatively dense reading documents. So tonight, as the Chair mentioned, staff is presenting an earnest, perhaps a 15-minute, hopefully succinct overview of the profiles themselves, profiles that represent the second batch of agency profiles specific to East Marin. The profiles are in draft form, and they tackle two agencies, although there are three service areas. We have Marin Municipal Water District, which serves essentially from Marinwood down to Sausalito along the 101 corridor. And then we also have North Marin Water District, which has a service area anchored in the Novato North 101 corridor, and then a separate water service area in the Point Reyes Station area. So two special districts under your purview, but as you go through the documents, you'll see that we've broken them into their three distinct service areas. And so tonight's goal, at least on staff's end, is to ultimately ask the commission, after you pick up on public comment, is whether you believe these profiles ultimately are sufficient relative to your scope of work in going forward with the very next phase, which is to open this up for a formal 60-day review period. And if you do agree that, yes, the documents by and large are sufficient for the time being, that means we are going to be on a clear path to bring you back a final report for a first reading in August. A final report that is not only going to include updated profiles on all 8 affected agencies. Remember, we have West Marin that we tackled a few months back, and now these East Marin agencies. But then we're also going to dive into the other items that by state law you're expected to address. And let me just stop here for a second and just give a couple seconds of context. There's been a couple of questions asked to me as I've been going to the various city council meetings and community meetings, and there's perhaps an inference or a perception that this is kind of a discretionary academic exercise on the part of LAFCO. That is not true. This is actually your explicit attempt to address a legislative directive that LAFCO's, especially beginning in 2008, every 5 years dive into independently assessing the range, availability, and performance of municipal services relative to your prescribed regional growth management responsibilities. And the legislature has 2 particular outcomes that's important to keep in mind as you go through this document tonight and as we go forward in the process over the next few meetings. First and foremost, the legislature expects you to produce an independent data document that, quote unquote, contributes to the advantageous development of communities. And I'm not quoting myself, that's a quote from the LAFCO law book itself, okay? And that's where we are right now. We're in the course of trying to create an independent data document for you. And then the second expectation of the legislature as you go through this exercise is to ultimately take a series of policy actions, which again, starting in August, we're going to go into more detail. First and foremost, that means adopting a set of determinations on all of the prescribed governance and service factors that the state expects you to weigh in on, i.e., your own view on what are the infrastructure needs or deficiencies of services, again, relative to your regional planning responsibilities. And then also, this is to be the source document that you are going to use later this year in updating spheres of influence, identifying and recommending desired boundary changes, and possibly looking at governance reorganizations, whether you choose to flag for additional review or you do have the authority to initiate certain reorganizations on your very own. Either way, the legislature says if you go down those paths, they have to be tied to a municipal service review. So this is where this document is ultimately going. So with that context in mind, the 2 profiles before you, again, are in draft form. We've prepared them consistent with your approved scope of work, and that means we've really focused in on 3 particular areas. Your own take on population and demographics, your own take on the supply and demand issue. You'll recall a few meetings ago we talked about, well, what time frame should we use in kind of looking at supply and demand, and although it's somewhat bendable, we're really focusing in on a 10-year window. And then finally, the financial solvency of these services going forward, again, within a 10-year window. And so what I'd like to do, and certainly, Chair, you can stop me with any questions or engage any clarifications along the way, is maybe go over about 4 or 5 slides that I've prepared that, in my mind, kind of extract the key takeaways to date for the Commission's benefit and hopefully help direct some discussion not only amongst the members but also perhaps orient some comments from the audience. And at the end of that presentation, certainly we'd ask that you formally open up the public hearing again, take any comments, and then at the Chair's discretion, consider our recommendation that let's go forward with the next phase. So with that, you know, and I'm learning as I go, and one of the things we did when we introduced the West Marin agencies is I didn't provide enough premises, and I think I caused a little unnecessary noise in the room. So if you just humor me for a couple seconds, I just wanted to get a couple of qualifiers out into the open. And first and foremost, okay, this is a LAFCO activity, and that means this is LAFCO's own independent analysis. And in the course of doing our own analysis, it is somewhat inevitable that our projections or estimates, whether it be on population, whether it be on water demands, are going to differ okay a bit from the affected agencies, and for that matter, some other third parties, whether it be ABAG or whatnot. I certainly think that this is not only okay, but in many ways healthy, that we have some difference of opinions. Also keep in mind, and I know this is an important distinction for the two water agencies, and I know we have representatives from both districts in attendance this evening. LAFCO is preparing a municipal service review. We're not preparing, Plan Bay Area 2.0, and we're not preparing a new urban water management plan. So there's different orientations that are going into this. So again, some of the estimates, some of the projections are going to be different. If there are big red flags of differences, we're certainly going to flag those for you and have more discussion, but I just want to put that up on the dais. And then second, our data review is from 2009 to 2013. So all of our projections, for the most part, are generated from looking at population changes, water service supplies and demands over that period. Now that means a couple things. One is we've only captured the first 2 years of the current 4-year drought. So hey, fair enough criticism. We're not capturing the most recent changes in usage over the last 12 to 16 months. But I would say that's okay, because again, we're looking at regional planning over the long term. And while the last 2 years are informative, so is the 5-year period that we have used in this report. And I certainly think that it's an appropriate size sample. But I think that's something that in the past, when we talked with the West Marin agencies, there was some discussion about if it was an appropriate sample size. I say to you, absolutely, but I'd be happy to go into more detail as we go forward with that. So let's start off, and these slides are 3 or 4 numbered, and I promise I'm not going to take too much time going through the PowerPoint, because I know at least Commissioner Burdick has made it clear in the past he's not a big fan of PowerPoints like I am, so I have that on my radar, trust me. But the very... Well, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So let's talk a little bit about demographics. And again, LAFCO has done its own projections here, and at the end of the day, we feel we've come up with a pretty good system that's based on looking at residential service connections. And we have a metric that then applies per unit or per service connection based on if it's in an urban area, a rural area, or a suburban area. And using this system, we ultimately come up with a population number that falls right into the middle, and I think that's appropriate, of what ABAG has. ABAG's a little higher than us, and Department of Finance is a little lower than us. But right now we say these 3 service areas combined tally up to about 250,000. And of that number, certainly the biggest portion goes into the Marin Municipal with about 186,000. And then we have 64,000 divided into North Marin's 2 service areas. About 2,000 in the Point Reyes Station area, and the rest in the Novato, Belmarin, Keys, Indian Valley area. Now, in looking at the trends, a couple of things of interest to LAFCO, and this came up when we were talking about West Marin. And I'll say this as a newbie, you walk into a new county and you kind of have a perception of where the proportional growth is going, and you say, well, it's probably going in the 101 corridor. Well, proportionally, and this kind of played out when we looked at Muir Beach, Stinson Beach, and Bolinas, proportionally, North Marin Point Reyes growth rate was 4 times higher than the growth rate along the 101 corridor. So again, there's probably some unique factors that go into it, and as we'll talk about, even something as, I think pertinent, but as small as the difference in connection fees, play a role in where people are deciding to build. And again, that's something of interest for LAFCO, and I'll come back to that latter comment in a second. In terms of new growth, one of the things we thought would be helpful is to make our effort into projecting build-out populations for the 3 service areas. And I know that making build-out populations can get a bit polarizing because you're dealing with 12 land use authorities, and you're dealing with unique dynamics in each. But we thought, hey, let's add up all the likely development as identified in the housing elements. Let's identify where those are within the agency's boundaries using Marin Map, and let's come up with a number. And so as we detailed in our written report, while there's not going to be a whole lot of development relative to the Bay Area, you're still looking at adding about 28,000 people just based on housing elements alone within these service areas. And of course, the bulk of that is going to likely go into the Marin Municipal Water District. And that's by way of adding about 8,500 new housing units. And so just for the benefit of a clarification, what do I mean by build out? Well, build out is a moving target. And so right now the build out is, again, this number 28,000, but in 20 years, the state is not going to, I don't think, lose its intention of requiring that local jurisdictions provide housing for their workforce. So that number will be different and presumably will increase as we go forward. But as of today, it's reasonable to say there's going to be 28,000 new people showing up in Marin over the next 30 to 100 years, depending on the growth rate. As we provide on the report, some of these community or some of these agencies' projected population build out is not until 2100. So it's going to take a while, but this number we're going to come back to when we start saying to the commission, okay, if there's no further changes in the world, if climate change stopped and we could just put everything in a bubble, what would be the ultimate water demand? I'm going to come back to using that number in just a bit. So the next few slides are specific to looking at this important relationship of supply and demand. And then ultimately, we're going to show you a slide that's kind of the money shot that matches up what's the supply, what's the demand, and what are the ratios. So this slide essentially says, okay, what is the water supplies available to these two agencies under perfect conditions? And then what's the water supply for these two agencies under the not-so-perfect conditions? And the not-so-perfect conditions are explicitly tied to applying 1977 water year numbers to current conditions. And so the key takeaway here, and it's important, is there's about a 70% reduction in the amount of water that ultimately would be available for these three agencies collectively from perfect conditions in which the reservoirs are always full versus when you're in a drought, a severe single-year drought like you had in 1977. And you can see the individual numbers worked out. And one of the differences from this work compared to what we did with West Marin, these agencies already did their own urban water management plans, so your staff is not producing those numbers for the most part. These are coming from the agency's urban water management plan. So at least you won't have that discussion about whether staff's math is good or bad. For the most part, this is drawn from their urban water management plans. So again, keep in mind that you have about a 70% reduction if 1977 shows up again. So what about demand? Important qualification. For the most part, LAFCO is focusing on production demand. The water agencies understandably focus quite a bit on per capita demand. And there's a reason for that, and it's tied to how the state calculates and measures water savings. So we've done our best to kind of incorporate both. But the overall comment here is, of these three agencies, the overall number is slowly going down over the 5-year period, and certainly Marin Municipal is leading the way. In the 5-year period that we tracked, they saved about 400 acre-feet of water from 2009 to 2013. And that's a pretty good savings, and especially when you consider they took on, by our estimate, 700 new residents during that 2009 to 2013 period. So you can certainly say they're on the way of efficiencies. North Marin's two water service is a bit of a mixed bag. The Novato, the main service area, intensified a bit between 09 and 13 by going up about 400 acre feet or so. And I think there is a microclimate issue in play there that helps to explain why some of this intensification occurred. Now, conversely, in a more cooler climate, you see that Point Reyes dropped quite a bit. It dropped by about 15%. Part of that is just microclimate. The other is, and this is an important comment to keep in mind when especially we go back to the West Marin agencies. They had one customer, I guess a commercial dairy, that closed up shop in 2010. and that was one of their biggest users. So in West Marin, one or two big customers really can have an impact on the total water amount, whereas Novato and then Marin Municipal, maybe not as much. So now we've talked about the supply and we've talked about the demand. So let's match those two up. And so this is the analysis that goes to LAFCO's attempt to start quantifying how much water really is there relative to growth now and over the next 10 years, and as we'll talk about just for the benefit of being provocative, at build-out. So at this slide you can see, hey, in a perfect world when the water is in the reservoirs, all three service areas have quite a bit of capacity. In fact, at the minimum, they have at least 57% extra capacity to meet future demand. So when times are good and it's a normal high rainfall amount, you've got a supply here in Marin County. I'll also note, even though it's not on this sheet, but it's an important a metric that your staff is using, on a per day basis, when you match up how much supplies can these agencies have access to versus what is their peak demand, meaning what's the highest demand they record in the summer months, all of them also have sufficient capacity. And of course, that's not true for some of the West Marin agencies, as we talked about a few meetings ago. So the key comment here is when there's normal weather and there's rain occurring on a somewhat normal basis to past seasons, things are good here in Marin. You don't have deficits, and that's not a throwaway comment. I've been in other counties where even under normal and high wet weather periods, they're still having trouble with demand. So that comment should be taken with certainly some substance. Now, what happens when we go back, though, and we start saying, well, what's the water supply for LAFCO's point of view if we get back to a 1977 planning period? And again, 1977 is a typical baseline year to kind of plan a worst-case scenario. And as you can see, well, things get a bit iffy. And, well, at least they get iffy for the 101 corridor. I'll make a quick parenthetical comment that Point Reyes Station, they've got a water supply that looks pretty resilient. Part of that is because North Marin has an effective agreement in place during drought periods where they can backfill their water supply. So for the most part, Point Reyes Station is in a good spot. But when you're looking at North Marin's Novato and Marin Municipal, they've got some redding occurring. And certainly between the two, you can see that Marin Municipal has a deficit already under this scenario. North Marin Novato is getting close to being at capacity at 93%, but Marin Municipal is already in a 5% hole. That intensifies when you start talking about peak day demands. Marin Municipal has a deficit of 55% right now, and while they're on the path to water savings, by 2023 we still estimate they're going to be in a 50% deficit, whereas North Marin Novato, right now they have a 3% deficit. And that's actually going to go up because, again, based on that 5-year period, they've intensified their use. So we anticipate their shortfall in summer, peak summer days going up to 117 or 17%, all of which is a justification why we spend quite a bit of time talking about storage supplies in the report. And let me just pause here, and I should have done this earlier. All of this is somewhat captured in attachment 2. So we made an effort to kind of put all of our numbers in basically one document. And so for easy reference, both tonight and going forward, you can take a look at that document. And that document also weighs in on some financial ratios that we've been working on. So my very last slide that I want to talk to the Commission about before you pivot and you open up for public comment and you start giving staff some feedback is, again, this kind of hypothetical scenario, which I think the legislature wants you to talk about. And that is, okay, what is the relationship between what our water supplies are and what our growth projections are, not just in this 10-year window, but over a more sustained and long-term period. So as I mentioned to you, we did our own projections for build-out. And so we essentially made a calculation that said, okay, assuming that the build-out number occurs, and assuming that the supply number for drought conditions stays stagnant, how much water is available per person by the time each agency hits build-out? And so that's what you're looking at. So for Marin Municipal, we're projecting that they would have to reduce by at least 13%, and their per capita number could not go over 111 gallons per person in order just to have enough water during the 1977 baseline year. Right now, they're at 127. We think they'll go down to 122 in 10 years. But again, that's a big number for them to get to. And I'm going to come back to this comment about what is the definition of an adequate water supply for LAFCO's benefit. Now, the other two are in a little better shape. North Marin, Novato, given their supply and given their development is not likely going to be as intense as Marin Municipal going forward to build out, they just have to, in our math, stay below 141 gallons per person. Right now, they're at 130. They're on track in the next 10 years, though, to reach 144. So you can see there's already kind of a tipping point that on paper, if at least you agree with our math, they're approaching. And then finally, again, Point Reyes is well within their build-out number, even under a drought scenario. We estimate they would have to keep everyone below 152 per person. They're already at 118, and they're on pace to be at 109 by 2023. So again, if you were to summarize the water supply relationship for these three areas, you would say things are looking good in North Marin, Point Reyes. Things are okay in North Marin, Novato. Certainly they have some challenges in the next few years in terms of water conservation is going to be key. But they are, in terms of build-out, looking at the need either to really cut back or to develop some new supplies. And then Marin Municipal, they've got a supply question, especially going forward, that merits some discussion. And this kind of leads me to these three policy comments that I want to just leave as kind of tea leaves for the commission to think about as we start looking for public comment and as we start approaching a final report. And that is, where is staff projecting this analysis is going to go in terms of core policy issues? Well, there's three things. First and foremost, there is a bit of a blind spot right now for our review for East Marin, or Central Marin, if you will, about Nicasio. Staff has been contacted a number of times by individual landowners, as I know Marin Municipal has, about how can they perhaps get a public potable water supply. A number of them are reporting wells are going dry. There are a couple of private mutual water companies who are in various states of distress. This is a LAFCO issue on a couple of fronts. One is, there's always the option of creating, if the will is there, i.e. finances, a special district to either be a contract agency with a willing provider, or an agency that at least could enter into long-term debt on its own on behalf of the community to perhaps build its own community well. The other issue is outside service connections. There's a funny part of LAFCO law that deals with whether trucked-in water requires your approval. Now, right now, and I would defer to Michael Ban, who's here from Marin Municipal, I don't think Marin Municipal is doing any trucked-in water for people, i.e. A landowner calls in and says, hey, can I show up at wherever and fill up my tank and do a truck route to my property and fill my tank. I think right now, because of the water situation, they have said no to that. Under 56133, and I know a lot of LAFCOs are dealing with this, you can read the law to say that kind of has to go through LAFCO, and it's not very clear to me how LAFCO can effectively address that with the idea that we don't want to cause more headaches for people who perhaps are looking at a tough time. So that's a policy question that we want to kind of vet out for the commission and at least offer some credible thoughts on how you may want to address what might be a looming issue for you, an increasing issue for you going forward. The other issue is the water supply. So we talked about Marin Municipal having a deficit in single dry year conditions. That's to be expected to some degree. All big urban service providers, or I shouldn't say all, but a lot of them come up short when they start penciling out their water supplies on paper. The question that this commission needs to start asking is, when we start getting proposals, and you will get proposals in the near term for annexations into Marin Municipal, how do you deal with the question that the legislature asks you, which is, does this agency have adequate water supplies? I think ultimately the commission needs to come up with some kind of comfort level, either explicit or implicit, about what is an appropriate supply. How much of a deficit is appropriate, i.e. how much, kind of in the financial sense, how much, debt to net assets ratio is appropriate before you say there's a problem here. So that's something I want to put on your radar. And then finally, and I don't say this to be provocative, okay, but when you look at the LAFCO law book, and I've talked to enough people who have already raised this issue, when you go through a service review, one of the questions that is asked is, are there opportunities for governmental efficiencies through a reorganization? Okay, so when you look at the 101 corridor, a question would be asked, is there any possible benefit at looking at a consolidation between these two service agencies that are lined up next to each other, Marin Municipal to the south and North Marin to the north? I can tell you right now that I don't know if there's any benefit, but I do know that there probably is a justification for us to at least do a little pen to paper and scope out any potential benefit or disadvantage to incorporate into a final report, and then in a very preliminary setting, allow the commission to tell staff, is this something that you want to invest resources in looking any further into? I could certainly say that it would be a resource exercise, and so what staff is proposing is doing a brief memo, if you will, working with the two agencies just to outline the basics of what challenges would there be and what opportunities would there be, and then show it to the commission. And if you say, hey, we've got 99 other things on our plate, and I don't, you collectively don't see the value in going down that path, that's sufficient. But I think the expectation on the legislature's part is at least we justify the baseline. And if the baseline is the way it works now is the best alternative, well, then let's have that, even if it's one sentence. Let's put that in the report. So there's some documentation that, hey, Marin LAFCO thought about this, and here's our response. So that was probably a little longer than I had promised, but nonetheless, that's the big picture as we see it with respect to the East Marin agencies. Again, we have Michael Band from Marin Municipal. We have Chris DeGabriel from North Marin Water District in attendance, and I do want the commission to know how appreciative your staff is of both of these gentlemen and their staffs in allowing us to kind of go through their records and ask a lot of questions in our learning curve. They've been great. And perhaps as you open up the public hearing, just as a courtesy, ask those two gentlemen to see if they'd like to say anything first, and then open it up, and then we're here to get direction. And ultimately the question is, at least for a good first draft, is this sufficient? And can we go forward with the formal review? Or is some more work need to be done before we go public? So with that, thank you, Chair.
And before we open it to the public, if you have some questions for the report.
Yes, thank you, Keen. That was an extremely interesting report, both written and oral, very helpful. So what I'm trying to understand at this point, this is a very interesting slide. We're obviously in a context now where there are state and local mandates for water reduction. And so what I'm trying to understand is how those mandates and adjustments in usage that may have happened. Obviously, you noted that this data is from 2013, and so it doesn't capture the last year and a half. But how would this agency capture those behavioral changes going forward? Is this a report that would be updated in the next year to capture what hopefully will be some significant adjustment in behaviors So
Yeah,
this
no.
needs to be a living document in the context of the drought and the mandates that we currently have, I would think.
Absolutely, and so I think the term you used, living document, is a good one. So the legislature has an expectation to some degree, whether it's a memo or a more detailed update, that every 5 years or so you do this type of review. And so the way we've purposely formatted this report is to be adaptable to tracking changes. So what I would envision is in 5 years or so, we essentially go back and we create new columns to the right of the existing columns that you have and say, okay, here's where this information of the last 5 years went. And I'm guessing that because of these external, and they're external, and we're not quite sure how to treat them, frankly, in this report, these external demand/expectations for the two water agencies, urban water agencies, to reduce their per capita usage. And so it goes back to that difference between water demand, production, and per capita. But I'm not sure how we can effectively address it in this document, but it's certainly something that, as we go forward, we'd like to track.
Is it something, given that we already know that there are some external mandates that are aimed at per capita usage, is that something that we'd want to mention in this report
Certainly.
as existing constraints going forward, just to flag it?
Certainly.
Yeah, I think that could be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions to staff? Yes.
I'm not sure this is going to work. I apologize if you have it in the report, but
It needs there's a little tab
yeah, no, I should know that, right? Yeah. Gotta be hurry. Let me try once again. You made reference, Keenan, thank you for the report, the comprehensive report. You made reference to the independence that you have experienced, that you have incorporated in your report, rather. And I think that's certainly commendable. But I'm also curious, since I'll take MMWD as an example, this is their business to deal with many of these issues. So I'm curious as to how much your conclusions differ from, pick anyone or perhaps all, but MMWD as a starting point. Are they about the same or
No,
significantly different?
and that's an outstanding question. So there are certainly similarities, but not identical numbers, let's say, for population. I believe that, and I'll defer to Mr. Ban on this, I believe both North Marin and Marin Municipal use census blocks, let's say, for their population projections. So there are, probably within 2 or 3% of our numbers. We think, staff thinks, that using the service connections is a better nexus because, hey, you're dealing with a utility, and census blocks have what we think are some blind spots. But again, the difference there is minimal. Now, there are certain places where we absolutely look to the agencies for their number, and the best example is we did it in West Marin because it wasn't there, but these two agencies projected their drought supply in 1977 conditions. We used that number, we looked at it and said, hey, this seems, we understand the math, we're using your numbers. So for the most part, there are some differences, but in that water supply number, where I think you got a lot of pushback, at least verbally at our last meeting on that, I don't think you'll have that here.
Okay, so it's reasonably aligned with
Yes.
the districts. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
So, Keen, we spoke briefly about this, but in regards to the water menu for Marin County, one of the things that we really need to emphasize, I believe, in the MSRs is recycled water. So it seems to be lacking in the documents. There's some timelines I think that are important, like on MMWD, the 1985 agreement. Now, that, of course, that's post-77, but still very important when the 2 MGD recycled water facility came in effect. And likewise, North Marin Water is participating in recycled water as well. So I think it really strengthened the document, particularly those activities here in Marin that relate to recycled water and our supply-demand projections going forward.
We will tackle recycled water in future drafts, as well as, and Commissioner Murray, I apologize for not mentioning it in my verbal report, but You've asked a couple times about where's the information about the watershed. It's on our to-do list, we just haven't got to it yet, but recycled water, the watersheds, and then the comment from Commissioner Sears about incorporating the elephant in the room about these external expectations of conservation.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah,
Commissioner.
quick one, Keenan. Sharon, everyone's commending you for a lot of work. In fact, I learned a lot of the history of some of the areas courtesy of your report. But as you correctly noted, probably one of the more, shall we say, controversial aspects of this, if it, once it does become more known to the public, would be your estimates of population growth over time, number of likely additional housing units in the county, build-out projections. So if you could spend a little bit more time on what some of your assumptions were on that, because I think that does drive a lot of your other analysis in terms of shortfalls or the like in terms of water.
Absolutely. So the way we came up with the population projections is we opened up all 12 land use authorities. You got the 11 cities, you got the county of Marin, and we opened up their housing elements, which just so happened to be in the course of being updated. So it was actually pretty good timing on our end. And luckily, a lot of the agencies did the specific analysis we were looking at is not the total bulk number that, hey, if the county went building crazy, how much could we really maximize our numbers? But we looked at the number that usually is in some phrase likely developable or some variation of that number. And so for each of the agencies, and this was particularly easy for the cities because for the most part, all of the cities are either, 10 of them are in Marin Municipal, 1 is in North Marin. We were able to get their housing number for each city, their likely unit, and then apply a factor of either 2.8 persons per housing unit if they were in a rural or suburban area, or 3.3 if they were in the cities. And that's consistent actually with some direction from the Department of Finance on how they go about doing some estimates. Now, the county was a little more tricky when we get to Point Reyes because there's no city there, and we had to do some looking at housing element addresses and matching them up on a Marin map to say, okay, this falls into the North Marin service area. What I can do, because I've talked to a couple people already about this, Commissioner Connolly, so I think you're already on top of this, we'll create an appendice that lists per jurisdiction the number of housing units per land use authority. And I already know, because someone corrected me, that our number for Mill Valley apparently now, even though I thought they had finished it, apparently it's not done yet. They just changed their number last week. So that's going to be a tweak that we'll do for the next report.
Perhaps, yeah, I think that would be a good addition. And perhaps in connection with that, some sort of footnote or asterisk. I mean, the common refrain as communities go through these housing element exercises, which, as we all know, are in response to state directives to do so, is that, well, that doesn't actually reflect the number of units that will be built.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we at least need to flag that issue, that, it's not a scientific endeavor, that those are the number of units that will be built.
We will certainly soften our language in terms of the distinction, as you mentioned, between what at least is on paper versus the reality that it's still a market-controlled scenario and the authorities have to still approve these things. So thank you.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, then at this point, I'll open it up to public questions. Anybody have any comments or questions of staff that they'd like to ask at this time? Please step forward.
Don't be bashful.
I knew there had to be one.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, and when the mic is on, if you could please state your name and the agency that you represent.
Sure. My name is Chris DeGabriel. I'm the manager of the North Marin Water District. And you can't spend a night away from your family and not say something, right? So in essence, Keen's done a good job working with the North Marin Water District, and I'm sure Marin Municipal on developing the profiles. I think that, you know, we don't have a big difference of opinion on the data that's included. There are a couple of things I just want to point out that for your knowledge, if you don't, or maybe I'm repeating myself, but that's okay. You know, we're highly regulated by the state, so we annually have to report to Department of Water Resources with regard to population, water demand, water supply. We annually have to report to the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Drinking Water with the similar data, along with water quality data and our available storage to meet emergency requirements and redundancy of supply and all of that. We annually have to report to the State Water Resources Control Board on our use of water that we're permitted. All these waters are waters of the state of California. They don't belong to us, but we have a permit that authorizes us to use them for beneficial uses. And those beneficial uses have to be called out specifically in both quantity, rate of use, and where that water is used, place of use, and purpose of use, what that water is used for. So those are some of the regulatory obligations that we must meet annually, and that information has been provided to Keen. He mentioned he took an independent viewpoint on all of that, but that data is available, and I think pretty well reflected in the report. Additionally, since our water districts are larger, and let me, for just clarification, explain that our West Marin service area is a completely separate service area. It has a completely separate water supply, completely separate sets of books and charges, and there's no interconnection between Novato and West Marin. Similarly, it has a completely set of separate identification with the state of California, separate water rights, separate permit to operate under the Division of Drinking Water, separate reporting requirements under the Department of Water Resources. But it's a smaller service area. There's no obligation to prepare an urban water management plan that our larger service area does have to prepare every 5 years, similar to Marin Municipal Water District, to not only reflect current water demands, water supply, population, but also to look out 25 years in the future as to what is that growth anticipated, where did those growth numbers come from, whether that's general plans of the county or the city or ABAG, and then similarly, do you have enough water supply to meet that projected growth and its demand under normal year conditions, single dry year conditions, or multiple dry year conditions? And those very significant reports have to be updated every 5 years. And we're in that 5-year window right now. Additionally, Keen mentioned right down in the bottom is footnote, external influences. So in 2009, the Comprehensive Water Supply Act was passed by the state legislature, and part of that act required a 20% reduction in per capita water use by the year 2020. We're there now, likely due to other external circumstances, principally the drought. But I want to point out one thing, that our region, since we all get water from the Russian River, collectively we have worked together, formed what is known as the Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership, and with a formal memorandum of understanding, and filed with the state a regional alliance to comply with this act, not individually by each city or water district, but collectively by the region. So we're meeting this obligation not only beyond our jurisdictional boundaries, but beyond our watershed boundaries. So it's a novel approach that the state anticipated might be able to save more water than could be done individually. So the members of that Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership include the town of Windsor, City of Santa Rosa, City of Rohnert Park, Cotati, Petaluma, Sonoma, Valley of the Moon Water District, North Marin Water District, and Marin Municipal Water District. And the 10th member is Sonoma County Water Agency, which is the wholesale water supplier providing us water throughout the Sonoma Marin region. Okay. So a couple of other things. You know, the projections that Keene identified, I think they're the differences between the district, at least North Marin's projections and LAFCO's projections are too minimal to quibble about, and I think Keene would agree with that perspective. But I do think, though, that a 5-year regression analysis is short. When we look at our projections in the future, we use a much longer period, and it's because we have a much longer database to rely on. Suggesting that LAFCO staff do that would be burdensome, just collecting that information, let alone performing the analysis. Another thing that we do that was not done by LAFCO is weather normalization. So the time period that Keene used was 2009 to 2013. 2009 was a regulatory drought in our region. There was a impairment on the Russian River system due to fishery requirements in the upper Russian River, and we had to cut back by 25% in our deliveries during the summer months. Additionally, 2011 was a huge water year. So you have these fluctuations that the weather needs to be taken out of that when you do these long-range projections that the water districts use in our planning documents and are not reflected here. Additionally, on recycled water, I think that's, at least for North Marin, that's how we're going to get to this 20 by 2020 target that the state has mandated. And that 20% reduction by 2020 is only going to go down. They will, after this drought period subsides, the legislature will take this up again, and that 20% will probably become 25% or 30% in the future. That's just one man's prediction, I guess. But that's what we'll all be looking for, is to gain more efficiency, develop those local supplies, principally with recycled water. There is interest in Sonoma County about utilizing aquifer storage and recovery, bringing that Russian River water when it's ample in the winter, storing it in the groundwater so it could be available to remove in the summer months and not have as big an environmental impact on fisheries. So, and that last year's legislation, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, will enable that process to begin. But developing new water supplies take a long time. It took us 20 years to develop our recycled water system in Novato, and we've done a great job, and we have another phase that is under design right now, and will help us increase the use of recycled water in Novato at this point in time. I think the two other things I just wanted to mention with regard to Nicasio and the public water supply. I'm convinced there's a solution to that, and it's not a terribly complex solution. I'm happy to talk with Keene about it. I've talked with my colleagues at Marin Municipal about it. I don't believe that LAFCO has the authority to permit trucking of water, and I don't think you really want to get into that area because trucking water comes about when there's a crisis. And the last thing we're going to do is to prevent people from having water for drinking in their communities. And then finally, I just wanted to mention one thing that I'd like the Commission to consider in their policy consideration is something I talked with Keene about when we first started this process is boundary changes. In North Marin and West Marin, we have a historical service area on the east side of Tomales Bay in the Marshall area. And this was formed at the time when a multi-lane highway was anticipated to run up the east side of Tomales Bay. And we were searching for water supply to serve that area at that time in the late 50s, early 60s. I don't think I was even in grade school when that occurred. Nevertheless, we still have some remnant of a service area there with no facilities, no customers, no ability to serve anyone with anything. And it would be a great opportunity as part of this process to clean that remnant up from our service territory boundary. So with that, unless you have questions, I'll go back to bed.
Okay. Commissioner Murray.
Chris, thank you very much. That's very detailed. Appreciate that, you sharing your information. One of the things I think if you could speak to it is the storage capacity and how North Marin Water District's looking at that, and also how LAFCO may want to look at that in terms of policies, if you think that'd be effective. You mentioned not trucking, but particularly with local reservoirs at capacity, but still at a water deficit, you think that would be effective?
Okay. So first of all, I need to know in the report that Keene prepared, he looked at potable water storage capacity to meet the peak demands of the system. And I think that both districts are adequately developed to meet the peak water demand needs, especially since we have redundant sources of supply from both local lakes and water treatment plants, along with imported water supply from the Russian River. Currently, North Marin is reconstructing our aqueduct from Petaluma to Novato along the Highway 101 corridor with the support of Marin Municipal to facilitate the highway widening in the future, but at the same time make that pipeline more reliable. We'll no longer have to pump water from Petaluma to Novato. It will be able to flow by gravity into our service area. So that's one thing. With regard to additional surface water supplies, if that's where you were, if your question lied, we do have, I believe, ample surface water supplies to meet our needs, especially with the construction of Lake Sonoma in Sonoma County in the late 1980s. which was subsequent to the drought of record in 76, 77. So my hat's off to all of those policymakers who worked hard to perfect that storage reservoir. Currently, all of those Sonoma Marin Saving Water partners receiving Russian River water use about 45 to 50,000 acre feet per year, and Lake Sonoma holds 245,000 acre feet. So there's ample volume of water in the Russian River system to meet our needs. Our challenge is navigating the environmental issues with listed fisheries, along with the facilities necessary to convey that water to the customers. So I'm not sure if I answered your question adequately. Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Anyone else like to speak?
I'm not the gentleman from MMWD. So I'm assuming this is okay. My name is Martha Turi, and I'm a resident of Fairfax. And I've made just a few notes, which I will go through and tick off. For those... I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now? Yes? Okay. Item. Saltwater intrusion from the bay side. I haven't seen in staff's report any documentation or reference to the intrusion that's forecast to occur within the studied period. So what that will do is impact 101 corridor development. It will reduce the amount of available development. Another item is that it might be appropriate at this moment, this far into a prolonged drought, to see if, revisit the state assumptions with respect to the extended drought. We need to know, I think, I would like to see this agency and the state documentation and the water district's documentation all be correlated, so that when a final report comes out, people are not saying, well, gee, DWR says this, and MMWD says this, LAFCO says this, and State Water Board says this, and the Regional Water Board says this, and so on. Because, that tends to happen. So as long as we're, within 5%, great. But I do think this is a moment to revisit the state assumptions. Item, it's not clear to me from this report, which I do want to say I think is a really great job of work in a very limited period of time with basically playing in the dark. There's not sufficient current data. The urban water management plans are under state law due every 5 years. This is the year 2015. They haven't been written yet, and simultaneously, we are working in an extended drought. So we don't have normal data, and at the moment, we don't have data that reflects the abnormalities. And we can't make good projections at this moment without updated data. So given all of that, I don't see anything that addresses a sustainability element. We don't have in this report, or so far as I know, within MMWD or any other agency at the state level, what constitutes a sustainable supply and demand of water for this county. We are approaching a zero elasticity of demand for water. People are going to hit the wall, especially in prolonged drought, as is documented with an existing deficit. People will get to the point where it's not going to be appropriate to say a per capita use of 111 gallons or 100 gallons. It might be more appropriate to allocate amongst the greater users, such as the 101 corridor and the households and the apartments, which is a planning element. But I would like to emphasize looking at a sustainability element for now and for the future. Next item, the question came to me as in reading, what is driving the policy car here? Is it a population projection, or is it the reality of limited supply? I'm not comfortable with state projections of population which say you need to accommodate this much development when ultimately what we can accommodate will be based on how much capital we can raise, how much revenue we can raise, how many alternative resources we can develop, such as recycled water, how much conservation we can do, and what is the supply. And I don't like feeling committed to burdens that I can't and won't meet. And I think that's, I'm saying when I'm talking about this county. And lastly, with respect to conservation, I've noticed that there are a couple of things that we might want to look at. There's a bill in the legislature right now that will revise some of the rules for toilets so that it would be possible to use recycled water, the purple pipes. And I think there may be some funding attached to that, although I'm not certain. I haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks. That might be of value to us. And lastly, it might be of value to look at whether we could, in MMWD territory with maybe, for example, Las Colinas, look at using and developing recycled water now to meet some of our conservation demand. That's all I have.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Last chance. Okay, we'll close it then to our public and bring it back to the commissioners. We're at a point now where we can give our input and then decide whether or not we want to close it for the public hearing, refer it back to Keene to continue with developing the report, and then having it come back to us again in August. Are there any comments? Commissioner Phillips?
Not at this point.
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Burdick.
Keene, could you touch upon a couple of the items that our last speaker touched on and how appropriate it is in an MSR to be dealing with a number of those very good questions and points, which seem to me to be good and solid points, but I'm not sure, how, whether they're addressed to the right body.
Well, so, and I did take copious notes, so I'll cherry pick a couple of comments. So the first, and it's a good comment, what are we, are we making any incorporation to the concept of saltwater intrusion and how that may play a role in affecting supply going forward? That was something immediately more on our radar as you went through the West Marin agencies, in particular when we talked about Stinson, Bolinas, given their location. We did not incorporate that yet here, partly because A, it's outside of our expertise, that's a big part, and then B, in dialogue with the two water agencies, other than Point Reyes station issues, I got the impression, and we certainly will vet this a little further out with Mike and Chris, that saltwater intrusion right now for their water supplies, given where they're located, is not an immediate concern. Not that it's not a long-term concern, but relative to this 5 or 10-year window that we're dealing with. But it merits at least some further discussion probably on our end. With respect to Martha's comment, and it's a good one about, hey, our data points stop at 13, so we're not picking up the reductions in 14 that presumably have occurred or whatever's occurred now. Hey, fair comment. However, again, you're operating a regional planning agency that is looking at more of the white swan that's going to be more predictable every year than the black swan. And I would suggest that what's going on right now, hopefully, presumably, is more of the black swan, where you're getting this odd extended drought that historically usually goes away at sooner than later, in that the 5-year period that we've pulled our data from is a fair example of what these districts can expect. You had, as Chris DeGabriel mentioned, you had 1 year in 2009 that was a very dry year. You had a year in which it was a very wet year in 2011. So I think overall our data points are good. That said, and this goes back to Commissioner Sears' comment, as we go forward, adding columns to the right to track this will only help. And then last but not least, I will certainly do my best to incorporate recent legislation on recycled water. Again, it's a bit outside of our expertise, but what we can pull, we'll pull, and we'll incorporate it into the next report. And if you say, hey, this is at least a starting point, great. Or if you say, we need a little more, then we can do that as well.
Any other comments?
Just a quick question with regard to the drought in 77. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm kind of between mics here. Sorry. Question with regard to the drought period of 77, which, of course, we've made an issue out of, and appropriately so, I would suggest. But I frankly don't have the history. How many years was data collected prior to 77?
And I would defer, if I get this wrong, to the agencies, but I believe both these districts have been collecting data well and ahead of the 77 year. Now, here's a bit of your apple-to-apple challenge, because we are doing analysis at the same time for the West Marin agencies. They don't have documentation that goes really too far back beyond 77. So in trying to create a somewhat of a uniform report, it gets a little challenging to make use of all the great information that Marin Municipal and North Marin have without it kind of looking implicitly like there's this huge blind spot for our West Marin agencies, because they just don't have the capacity to show that information.
I guess I was just curious as to what conclusion one might draw with regard to that 77 low point, if it occurred within the last, as a low point within the last 45 years versus the last 245 years, would be sort of an extreme as to how to account for that and therefore plan. So I don't have that benchmark. I don't know how far back that goes as a low point. So it's a little bit hard for me to say that's I mean, let's say that there was a drought in 57 that was 10 times worse. didn't happen, I suspect, but let's say that it happened, then maybe we should plan for that. Why is 77? It's fairly arbitrary. It's simply because we have data on it. So that's the reason for curiosity.
Yeah.
And one very minor point, I almost had to bring it up, but as long as I chatting, I will. MMWD, page 5, talks about the last bullet. Unemployment levels have increased by 47%. I think you need some context there, because if it's increased by 3 people versus whatever to equate to 47, again, it's a fairly small point, but I think you need context with regard to unemployment. It sounds pretty severe, but I doubt that it's that many individuals. So a context I would suggest in that. Sure.
Yes, Commissioner Bird.
We had 2 really terribly dry winters in '76 and '77. And my son was 2 years old, and we spent a year bathing in galvanized tubs. And that was no fun. 56 and 57 was the years of the Great Marysville and Yuba City flood, which killed a whole bunch of people. So those weren't dry winters. But I talked to some people who lived in Point Reyes all their lives in the 70s, who were in their 70s, 80s, who said this was just, the most catastrophic thing they'd ever seen. I mean, farmers were selling off their herds, and it was horrible. And if we didn't have a fire, thank God, we had the whole place would have gone up. It was really horrible. So I found the galvanized tub. Back into it.
Any other comments? Okay, I would just personally like to reiterate that I think it will be really helpful somewhere, whether it be an appendix or footnote, that you explain how the formula was developed for the population growths, for those projections. I think that's going to spark a lot of people's interest. And then also, you have down about the non-potable water to do
I've
that.
got it.
Good. And I just have a question. In the areas where there's this potential for shortage, is there any comment, do we put any input that creating a new storage facility would help?
There is going to be a section, and you'll see it beginning in August, assuming that I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, and you say go forward and circulate this and come back with a final report, where you're going to have a set of determinations that address infrastructure needs or deficiencies. In that section, we will make a first attempt at not only talking about what the commission, relative to your interest, and again, your interests are aligning this municipal service with your directive to provide services for existing and future community needs as you see it, not only storage needs, but perhaps topics ranging from, do we need to talk about the need to for new water supplies to be pursued? And that comment can go a lot of different directions, but I think, we're talking a lot, I think, so far about the conservation component, right? Well, there's also the component about supply enhancement. And so I guess to go back to maybe your question, yes, we're going to talk about our take on infrastructure needs, whether that means storage, supply enhancements, and then perhaps even more micro, although not too micro, issues within, let's say, major service zones. For example, Marin Municipal has outstanding storage capacity for, I think, all their zones except for, I think there's an issue in Ross Valley. Right now, it can't meet peak day demand. So that's something that we'd want to vet out a little further, because that's a big population center for the district.
Okay, good, thank you. And if there are no other comments, then this was an action item, so I would like to entertain a motion that we direct Keene to continue developing this and look forward to a formal public review with the final report in August.
I'll move.
Second?
Okay,
To vote? You need a
do-
vote now? All in favor?
yeah, do you call for roll call? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? All right, it's been approved unanimously. Keen, thank you so much
Well,
for that
thank you.
report. And for anyone that hasn't had an opportunity to look at it, it has all kinds of really interesting information about the development of the county. And so rather than reading something that's just chock full of statistics, there's some really interesting facts in here that are really interesting. So thank you for that. And then we'll continue with the report from the annual Cal LAFCO staff workshop.
Thank you, Chair. This one falls on me since Keen was not available to go this year. The staff workshop was held by Cal LAFCO in Grass Valley in April 15th through the 17th. I was lucky enough to go, thank you. And it was unfortunately a low turnout this year, mostly because of the location. It was hard for a lot of the other agency or LAFCOs to travel. So that was kind of a bummer. The sessions themselves were wonderful as usual. I always learned something, so that was definitely a benefit. One of the sessions was the on website design and enhancement, and I really got into that one. I have some good ideas for our website from that, and I want to semi-mimic Orange County's website. They have a lot of new cutting edge type of, I don't know, software, I guess it's called, or I don't know what it is. I don't know the lingo for it, but so there's some cool things that we can do that's out there, and I would like to do some of those things. So, thank you.
Ooh, great. Thank you, Candace.
Yep, the Bar National Hotel in Nevada City.
No, I did not.
Okay, and on to our executive officer report.
Nothing to add. Thank you so much.
Okay, and commissioners, any announcements or requests? No? Then move to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Thank you all.